My name is Freya, and the night I caught my boss crouched over my computer like a thief changed everything. There I stood, 37 years old, keys trembling in my hand as I watched Jerome flip through my private messages in the darkness of our empty office building. The blue glow from my monitor painted his guilty face as his stubby fingers scrolled through conversations I'd had with friends about my dating life, my financial struggles, even my mother's cancer treatment. When he finally sensed my presence and spun around, his excuse came out in nervous stutters about routine security protocols and company policy. But we both knew the truth. He'd been violating my privacy for months, reading every personal detail of my life like it was his entertainment. That moment should have destroyed me. Instead, it sparked the most beautiful plan I'd ever conceived. You see, discovering Jerome's disgusting habit wasn't the betrayal that broke me. The real devastation had happened 8 months earlier. On an ordinary Tuesday morning when I learned that my brilliant project proposal had somehow ended up presented word for word by my colleague Brighton to the board of directors. Brighton, who couldn't organize a grocery list without help, suddenly became the innovative genius behind a campaign that would revolutionize our marketing approach. I sat in that conference room, listening to Brighton stumble through my ideas, while Jerome nodded approvingly, and realized that my years of loyalty meant absolutely nothing. They'd stolen my creativity, my passion, my future, and then congratulated themselves for their cleverness. Before I tell you exactly how I turned Jerome's snooping addiction into his downfall, I'd really like to know if you've ever had someone steal something precious from you and pretend they deserved the credit. Because what I'm about to share will show you that sometimes the best revenge requires patience, creativity, and letting your enemy destroy themselves. And also like, subscribe, and click the bell icon if you really want to know how this story ends, because trust me, you won't see this coming. After Brighton's theft, I spent weeks documenting every suspicious interaction, every stolen idea, every time Jerome conveniently knew information he shouldn't have known. That's when I started noticing the pattern. Casual comments about conversations I'd only had through private messages, references to plans I'd never shared verbally, questions about people I'd never mentioned at work but had texted friends about. Jerome wasn't just stealing my professional ideas. He was harvesting my personal life for leverage. The discovery that night wasn't accidental. I'd been testing my theory for 3 weeks, leaving my workstation unlocked with increasingly obvious bait. Personal messages about fictional family emergencies, fake conversations about job interviews, made-up relationship drama. Every single topic would somehow surface in Jerome's casual workplace chatter within days. He thought he was being subtle, but Jerome had always been terrible at hiding his true nature. When I finally witnessed him, hunched over my keyboard that night, frantically scrolling through months of my private communications, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not hurt. Pure, crystalline clarity. Jerome had handed me the perfect weapon to destroy him, and he didn't even realize it. See, Jerome's greatest weakness wasn't his illegal snooping. It was his desperate need to feel smarter than everyone around him. He genuinely believed that stealing my personal information gave him some kind of strategic advantage, like he was playing chess while the rest of us played checkers. What he couldn't comprehend was that I'd been setting up this game for months, and he was about to become my unwitting pawn. The next morning, I started feeding Jerome exactly what he wanted to hear. Carefully crafted lies disguised as authentic personal communications. I began leaving my computer unlocked every evening, desktop cluttered with fake email conversations and fictional text message screenshots. Each piece of false information was designed to trigger Jerome's worst business instincts. First, I planted fake messages about our biggest client, Opal Industries, supposedly being unhappy with our campaign timeline. I created elaborate conversations with fictional friends about overhearing Opal executives discussing switching to our competitor. Within a week, Jerome was calling emergency meetings, pushing our team to deliver rushed, subpar work that actually did upset Opal Industries. They demanded significant revisions and threatened to reduce their contract value by 30%. Then I orchestrated fake personal conversations about our company's internal morale problems. I crafted messages to imaginary friends describing talented employees who were supposedly planning to quit. Jerome, convinced he had insider knowledge, began micromanaging these exact employees, creating the hostile work environment that drove them to actually consider leaving. His paranoid behavior became a self-fulfilling prophecy. My masterpiece, though, was the fake romantic drama I created with my non-existent boyfriend Ash. Through carefully staged text conversations, I painted Ash as a marketing executive at our biggest competitor, who was supposedly sharing industry secrets with me during our intimate moments. I described fictional dinner conversations where Ash revealed their company's expansion plans, client acquisition strategies, and budget allocations. Jerome became obsessed with this intelligence. He started making aggressive business moves based on completely fabricated information. Convinced he was staying one step ahead of the competition, he increased our prices, expecting clients to pay premium rates for superior service. He invested company resources in geographic markets that didn't exist. He restructured our team to counter competitive threats that were entirely imaginary. Meanwhile, I documented every instance of Jerome accessing my personal communications, screenshots of him at my workstation, security footage from the building's cameras, timestamps showing when my computer was accessed outside normal business hours. I built an airtight case proving months of systematic privacy violations, each one a federal crime under electronic surveillance laws. The beautiful irony was watching Jerome destroy his own company while believing he was outsmarting everyone. Each stolen piece of misinformation became another nail in his professional coffin. His erratic decision-making confused our actual clients, alienated our talented employees, and created genuine operational problems that attracted unwanted attention from industry regulators. But I wasn't finished. Jerome's biggest weakness was his ego, and I knew exactly how to exploit it. I started crafting the perfect trap. Over several weeks, I planted increasingly dramatic fake messages about my growing relationship with the fictional Ash. I described romantic evenings where Ash supposedly revealed confidential details about his company's plans to recruit specific employees from our firm. I created fake conversations about Ash offering me an executive position with a massive salary increase, along with subtle suggestions that I might bring valuable company information with me when I jumped ship. Jerome's behavior became increasingly desperate. He started working later hours, clearly spending more time reading my fabricated communications than focusing on actual business operations. He began making panicked phone calls to clients, trying to secure long-term contracts based on competitive intelligence that existed only in my imagination. He restructured employee compensation packages to prevent the mass exodus that was never going to happen. The most satisfying part was watching Jerome try to subtly probe for information about my relationship with Ash. He'd make casual comments about competitor companies, hoping I'd reveal something about my boyfriend's alleged insider knowledge. He'd ask about my weekend plans, fishing for details about romantic dinners where I supposedly learned industry secrets. Every conversation was Jerome desperately trying to confirm intelligence he'd stolen from my personal communications, never realizing that every detail was completely fabricated. 3 months into my campaign, Jerome made his biggest mistake. Convinced that our competitor was planning to poach our entire creative team, he preemptively fired 2 of our most talented employees, claiming budget constraints while secretly believing he was preventing defections. These employees immediately found better positions elsewhere, taking valuable client relationships with them. Our company's reputation in the industry began cracking. That's when I knew it was time for the final phase. I spent 2 weeks crafting the perfect fictional email chain between myself and a fabricated headhunter named River. Through carefully staged conversations, I created an elaborate job offer from Jerome's biggest competitor. The position was supposedly a senior executive role investigating corporate espionage and workplace harassment, with a salary that was exactly double what Jerome was paying me. Most importantly, the fake job description explicitly mentioned my experience identifying companies that illegally monitor employee communications. I saved this fabricated email chain to my desktop, making sure the file was prominently displayed when Jerome inevitably accessed my computer that evening. Then I waited. The next morning, Jerome arrived at work looking like he hadn't slept. His usual arrogant confidence was replaced by obvious panic. He kept glancing at me during our team meeting, clearly trying to determine if I was planning to leave. By afternoon, he'd scheduled a private conversation in his office. Jerome's desperation was palpable. He offered me a promotion I'd been requesting for 2 years. He promised a salary increase that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He talked about expanding my responsibilities and giving me creative control over major campaigns. Everything he'd denied me when I'd earned it through legitimate work was suddenly available because he thought I was about to expose his illegal behavior to his biggest competitor. I listened to Jerome's increasingly frantic offers with perfect composure, occasionally nodding thoughtfully while he promised me the world. He was so terrified of losing his imaginary competitive advantage that he was willing to give me everything I'd originally wanted, plus more. That's when I smiled and told Jerome I needed to make a phone call. I walked to my desk, opened my computer, and pulled up the real documents I'd been preparing for months. Not fake job offers or fabricated text conversations. Actual evidence of every privacy violation Jerome had committed. Screenshots, timestamps, security footage, and detailed logs of his illegal surveillance activities. Jerome watched in growing confusion as I dialed the number for our company's legal department. Then I called the state labor board. Finally, I contacted the federal agency responsible for investigating electronic surveillance crimes. As each conversation ended, Jerome's face grew paler. He finally understood that there was no boyfriend named Ash, no job offer from his competitor, no romantic dinners where industry secrets were shared. Every piece of intelligence he'd stolen from my personal communications was completely fabricated. But the evidence of his crimes was absolutely real. The investigation moved faster than I'd anticipated. Within days, federal agents were interviewing employees about workplace surveillance. The labor board opened a formal case about privacy violations. Our company's legal team began reviewing months of Jerome's decision-making, trying to understand why he'd made so many irrational business choices based on apparently non-existent information. Jerome's desperate attempts to explain his behavior only made things worse. He couldn't admit to illegally accessing employee communications without confessing to federal crimes. But he also couldn't explain his erratic business decisions without revealing the source of his supposedly superior intelligence. Watching Jerome realize that his own curiosity had been the weapon I'd used against him was more satisfying than I'd ever imagined. Every secret he'd stolen was actually misinformation I'd planted. Every advantage he thought he'd gained was actually another step toward his destruction. The man who believed he was outsmarting his employees had been dancing to my carefully orchestrated tune for months. The final irony came when Jerome tried to fire me in retaliation. Our company's legal team immediately blocked the termination, explaining that firing an employee who'd reported federal crimes would create additional legal liability. Jerome had become so trapped by his own illegal behavior that he couldn't even remove the person who'd exposed him. 2 weeks later, Jerome resigned in disgrace. Federal charges were filed for electronic surveillance violations. Our company faced massive fines and regulatory oversight. The employees Jerome had fired based on my fabricated intelligence sued for wrongful termination and won substantial settlements. But the real beauty of my plan was just beginning to unfold. You see, Jerome's resignation didn't end my story. It was actually the moment when everyone else started discovering the true scope of what he'd been doing. The federal investigation uncovered security footage showing Jerome accessing not just my computer, but workstations belonging to 6 other employees. He'd been systematically violating the privacy of nearly half our department for over a year. Each new revelation sent ripples through our industry. Word spread that our company had employed someone who illegally monitored employee communications to make business decisions. Clients began questioning whether their confidential information had been compromised. Competitors wondered if Jerome had shared stolen intelligence about their employees who'd previously worked for us. The most devastating discovery came when investigators found Jerome's personal files. He'd been keeping detailed notes about employees' private conversations, family situations, financial problems, and relationship issues. Not for business purposes, but because he genuinely enjoyed having power over people's personal lives. The man I'd thought was just unethically ambitious turned out to be a predator who got satisfaction from invading privacy. Reading those files changed everything for me. Seeing my colleagues' most intimate details cataloged like trophies made me realize that my elaborate revenge had accomplished something far more important than personal satisfaction. I'd exposed a dangerous person who'd been systematically abusing his authority to harm people who trusted him. Brighton's name appeared frequently in Jerome's notes. Apparently, Jerome had been reading Brighton's private messages for months before my project theft occurred. He'd learned about Brighton's insecurities, financial desperation, and willingness to do anything for career advancement. Jerome had deliberately manipulated Brighton into stealing my ideas, using stolen personal information to control and corrupt someone who might otherwise have been honest. This revelation transformed my anger into something deeper. Brighton wasn't just an opportunistic colleague who'd stolen my work. Brighton was another victim of Jerome's manipulation, someone whose privacy had been violated and whose weaknesses had been exploited for Jerome's entertainment. I reached out to Brighton privately, sharing what I'd learned about Jerome's surveillance and manipulation tactics. The conversation was awkward initially, but Brighton's relief was obvious. For months, Brighton had been struggling with guilt about the project theft, unable to understand how Jerome had known exactly which psychological pressure points to exploit. We talked for hours about Jerome's methods, how he'd use personal information to create artificial crises that made employees desperate enough to compromise their ethics, how he'd manufactured workplace drama by sharing private details between colleagues, how he'd destroyed friendships and professional relationships by strategically revealing confidential information at precisely the moments it would cause maximum damage. Brighton and I weren't the only victims. Jerome had been playing elaborate psychological games with our entire department, using stolen private information to manipulate, control, and humiliate people who'd done nothing wrong except trust their employer to respect basic privacy boundaries. The more we investigated, the more horrifying the pattern became. Jerome had driven 3 talented employees to quit by creating hostile work environments based on personal information he'd stolen from their private communications. He'd sabotaged romantic relationships between colleagues by sharing private messages out of context. He'd even used knowledge of family medical emergencies to pressure employees into working overtime during personal crises. But here's what Jerome never understood about the game he was playing. While he was busy violating everyone's privacy for his personal entertainment, he was also creating an army of people who had every reason to want justice. The federal investigation expanded as more employees came forward with evidence of privacy violations. The Labor Board opened additional cases. Our state attorney general began exploring criminal charges beyond just electronic surveillance. Jerome's illegal activities had created a web of legal liability that reached far beyond simple workplace harassment. Meanwhile, the business consequences of Jerome's decision-making continued cascading through our company. The clients he'd alienated with erratic behavior based on my fabricated intelligence were sharing their experiences with industry contacts. The employees he'd fired using stolen personal information were networking with former colleagues, spreading awareness about our company's toxic management culture. Most satisfying of all, the competitor company that Jerome had feared was supposedly trying to recruit me actually did reach out. Not because of any fictional boyfriend or fabricated job offer, but because they'd heard about my role in exposing Jerome's surveillance activities. They wanted to hire someone with my integrity and investigative skills. The irony was perfect. Jerome's paranoid fear of losing me to his competitor became reality, but only because his own illegal behavior had made me valuable to ethical companies that wanted to avoid hiring predators like him. When I accepted the new position, I made sure to send Jerome a final message, not through private communications that he could steal and misinterpret, but through an official letter delivered by our legal department. I thanked him for teaching me that patience and creativity could transform even the most devastating betrayal into an opportunity for justice. I explained how his illegal surveillance had actually helped me develop skills in strategic planning, evidence gathering, and psychological analysis that made me attractive to employers who valued ethical leadership. Most importantly, I told Jerome that his greatest weakness wasn't his need to feel superior to others. It was his inability to recognize that the people he was trying to manipulate were often smarter, more principled, and more creative than he'd ever imagined. The letter concluded with a detailed timeline of every piece of fabricated information I'd fed him through fake personal communications. I wanted Jerome to understand exactly how thoroughly he'd been outplayed. Every business decision he'd made based on stolen intelligence was listed alongside the fictional source that had inspired it. Reading that timeline, Jerome would finally comprehend the scope of his self-destruction, the fake boyfriend who'd never existed, the imaginary competitive threats that had driven him to alienate real clients, the fabricated employee concerns that had caused him to create actual workplace problems. Every advantage he'd thought he'd gained by violating privacy had actually been another step toward his professional destruction. But the most beautiful part of my revenge wasn't the legal consequences or career destruction Jerome faced. It was watching him realize that his victims had been stronger, smarter, and more ethical than he'd ever given them credit for. The employees Jerome had tried to manipulate and control began supporting each other, sharing resources for legal action and career advancement. Brighton used the settlement money from wrongful termination to start an independent consulting business. The colleagues Jerome had driven away found better positions and began recruiting talent away from our industry's toxic companies. Jerome's attempt to maintain power through illegal surveillance had actually created a network of principled professionals who were now working together to build more ethical workplaces. His victims had become allies, united by shared experiences of manipulation and strengthened by their collective pursuit of justice. 6 months after Jerome's resignation, I received news that federal prosecutors had filed criminal charges carrying potential prison time. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Jerome had been using similar surveillance tactics at previous companies, suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior spanning his entire career. Other victims began coming forward. Former employees from Jerome's previous positions shared stories of privacy violations, psychological manipulation, and professional sabotage. The man who thought he was cleverly exploiting human weaknesses had actually been creating a trail of evidence that law enforcement could follow across multiple jurisdictions and several years. Jerome's criminal trial became a case study in how workplace predators use surveillance technology to abuse their authority. Privacy rights organizations cited his prosecution as an example of why electronic monitoring laws needed stronger enforcement. Business schools began teaching his case as a warning about the legal and ethical risks of crossing professional boundaries. But for me, the most meaningful outcome was personal. My new employer promoted me to head their corporate ethics department, specifically because of my experience identifying and documenting surveillance abuse. My job now involves helping other companies recognize and prevent the kind of predatory behavior Jerome had normalized. Every week, I receive messages from employees who suspect they're being illegally monitored by supervisors. I help them gather evidence, understand their legal rights, and develop strategies for exposing workplace predators without risking retaliation. Jerome's abuse taught me skills that now protect hundreds of other potential victims. The work is emotionally challenging because I meet so many people who've experienced the same violation of trust that initially devastated me. But it's also incredibly rewarding because I can offer them something I didn't have during my darkest moments: proof that predators can be defeated, and that victims can transform their pain into power. Sometimes former colleagues ask if I regret not simply reporting Jerome's surveillance to authorities immediately, instead of orchestrating such an elaborate revenge plan. They wonder if my months of strategic manipulation were unnecessarily complex compared to straightforward legal action. But I know that direct confrontation would never have exposed the full scope of Jerome's predatory behavior. A simple privacy violation report might have resulted in his termination and minor penalties. My patient, methodical approach revealed years of systematic abuse affecting dozens of victims across multiple companies. Jerome's prosecution and imprisonment prevented him from continuing to harm people who would never have known to protect themselves. More importantly, my experience taught me that the most effective response to manipulation isn't anger or immediate retaliation. It's the careful application of intelligence, creativity, and ethical principles to ensure that predators face consequences that match the scope of their crimes. Jerome thought he was exploiting my vulnerability when he read my private communications. What he was actually doing was providing me with detailed intelligence about his methods, motivations, and weaknesses. Every privacy violation he committed gave me more insight into how his mind worked and how his behavior could be turned against him. The man who believed he was playing chess while his victims played checkers discovered too late that I'd been playing an entirely different game. While he was focused on stealing tactical information from personal communications, I was gathering strategic evidence for a comprehensive campaign that would destroy not just his career, but his freedom. Today, Jerome is serving a federal prison sentence for electronic surveillance crimes. His conviction established important legal precedents about workplace privacy rights. The civil settlements paid to his victims funded new career opportunities and educational programs. The companies that employed him implemented stronger oversight policies to prevent similar abuses. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome is knowing that Jerome's need to feel superior to others ultimately led to his complete humiliation. The man who derived pleasure from invading privacy spent years in an environment where his own privacy was completely eliminated. The predator who manipulated others through psychological pressure experienced firsthand what it felt like to be powerless. Jerome's story became a cautionary tale shared throughout our industry. His name is now synonymous with the career destruction that awaits supervisors who abuse surveillance technology. Young professionals learn about his case as an example of how ethical violations can escalate into criminal behavior that destroys not just careers, but entire lives. And me? I learned that the most devastating betrayals can become opportunities for the most meaningful victories. Jerome's invasion of my privacy taught me skills in investigation, strategy, and justice that now define my professional purpose. His attempt to steal my personal power actually helped me discover capabilities I never knew I possessed. Every morning when I help another employee gather evidence against an abusive supervisor, I remember the night I caught Jerome hunched over my computer. That moment of violation became the beginning of a journey that transformed my pain into purpose and my anger into action that protects others from experiencing similar abuse. Jerome tried to steal my privacy, my creativity, and my professional future. Instead, he gave me the motivation, skills, and evidence I needed to build something far more meaningful than anything he could have taken away. The predator became the prey. The manipulator became the victim of his own tactics, and the woman he thought he was exploiting became the architect of his complete destruction. Sometimes the most beautiful revenge is simply letting someone's own behavior become their punishment, while you use their abuse to build something better than what they tried to destroy. So if you've ever been violated by someone who thought they were smarter than you, remember my story. Document everything. Stay patient, be strategic, and never underestimate your own capacity to turn someone's greatest weapon against them into their ultimate weakness. What do you think about this approach to workplace justice? Have you ever dealt with a supervisor who violated your privacy or manipulated you using personal information? Leave a comment below about your experiences, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who turn their worst betrayals into their greatest victories, because trust me, Jerome wasn't the only predator who underestimated the wrong person.